The adventure that befell us on the way was also a surprising one. But I must tell the story in due order. An hour before Stepan Trofimovich and I came out into the street, a crowd of people, the hands from Spigulin's factory, 70 or more in number, had been marching through the town, and had been an object of curiosity to many spectators. They walked intentionally in good order and almost in silence. Afterwards it was asserted that these 70 had been elected out of the whole number of factory hands, amounting to about 900, to go to the governor and to try and get from him, in the absence of their employer, a just settlement of their grievances against the manager, who, in closing the factory and dismissing the workmen, had cheated them all in an impudent way, a fact which has since been proved conclusively. Some people still deny that there was any election of delegates, maintaining that 70 was too large a number to elect, and that the crowd simply consisted of those who had been most unfairly treated, and that they only came to ask for help in their own case, so that the general mutiny of the factory workers, about which there was such an uproar later on, had never existed at all. Others fiercely maintained that these 70 men were not simple strikers but revolutionists, that is, not merely that they were the most turbulent, but that they must have been worked upon by seditious manifestos. The fact is, it is still uncertain whether there had been any outside influence or incitement at work or not. My private opinion is that the workmen had not read the seditious manifestos at all, and if they had read them, would not have understood one word, for one reason, because the authors of such literature write very obscurely in spite of the boldness of their style. But as the workmen really were in a difficult plight and the police to whom they appealed would not enter into their grievances, what could be more natural than their idea of going in a body to the general himself if possible, with the petition at their head, forming up in an orderly way before his door, and as soon as he showed himself, all falling on their knees and crying out to him as to Providence itself. To my mind there is no need to see in this a mutiny or even a deputation, for it's a traditional, historical mode of action. The Russian people have always loved to parley with the general himself for the mere satisfaction of doing so, regardless of how the conversation may end. And so I am quite convinced that, even though Fyodor Stepanovich, Liputin, and perhaps some others, perhaps even Fedka too, had been flitting about among the workpeople talking to them, and there is fairly good evidence of this, they had only approached 2, 3, 5 at the most, trying to sound them, and nothing had come of their conversation. As for the mutiny they advocated, if the factory workers did understand anything of their propaganda, they would have left off listening to it at once as to something stupid that had nothing to do with them. Fedka was a different matter. He had more success, I believe, than Fyodor Stepanovich. 2 workmen are now known for a fact to have assisted Fedka in causing the fire in the town, which occurred 3 days afterwards, and a month later 3 men who had worked in the factory were arrested for robbery and arson in the province. But if in these cases Fedka did lure them to direct and immediate action, he could only have succeeded with these 5, for we heard of nothing of the sort being done by others. Be that as it may, the whole crowd of workpeople had at last reached the open space in front of the governor's house and were drawn up there in silence and good order. Then, gaping open-mouthed at the front door, they waited. I am told that as soon as they halted they took off their caps, that is, a good half-hour before the appearance of the governor, who, as ill luck would have it, was not at home at the moment. The police made their appearance at once, at first individual policemen and then as large a contingent of them as could be gathered together. They began, of course, by being menacing, ordering them to break up. But the workmen remained obstinately, like a flock of sheep at a fence, and replied laconically that they had come to see the general himself. It was evident that they were firmly determined. The unnatural shouting of the police ceased, and was quickly succeeded by deliberations, mysterious whispered instructions, and stern, fussy perplexity, which wrinkled the brows of the police officers. The head of the police preferred to await the arrival of the governor himself. It was not true that he galloped to the spot with 3 horses at full speed, and began hitting out right and left before he alighted from his carriage. It's true that he used to dash about and was fond of dashing about at full speed in a carriage with a yellow back, and while his trace horses, who were so trained to carry their heads that they looked positively perverted, galloped more and more frantically, rousing the enthusiasm of all the shopkeepers in the bazaar, he would rise up in the carriage, stand erect, holding on by a strap which had been fixed on purpose at the side, and with his right arm extended into space like a figure on a monument, survey the town majestically. But in the present case he did not use his fists, and though as he got out of the carriage he could not refrain from a forcible expression, this was simply done to keep up his popularity. There is a still more absurd story that soldiers were brought up with bayonets, and that a telegram was sent for artillery and Cossacks. Those are legends which are not believed now even by those who invented them. It's an absurd story, too, that barrels of water were brought from the fire brigade, and that people were drenched with water from them. The simple fact is that Ilya Ilyich shouted in his heat that he wouldn't let one of them come dry out of the water. Probably this was the foundation of the barrel legend which got into the columns of the Petersburg and Moscow newspapers. Probably the most accurate version was that at first all the available police formed a cordon round the crowd, and a messenger was sent for Lemka, a police superintendent, who dashed off in the carriage belonging to the head of the police on the way to Skvoreshniki, knowing that Lemka had gone there in his carriage half an hour before. But I must confess that I am still unable to answer the question how they could at first sight, from the first moment, have transformed an insignificant, that is to say an ordinary, crowd of petitioners, even though there were several of them, into a rebellion which threatened to shake the foundations of the state. Why did Lemka himself rush at that idea when he arrived 20 minutes after the messenger? I imagine, but again it's only my private opinion, that it was to the interest of Ilya Ilyich, who was a crony of the factory managers, to represent the crowd in this light to Lemka, in order to prevent him from going into the case, and Lemka himself had put the idea into his head. In the course of the last 2 days, he had had 2 unusual and mysterious conversations with him. It is true they were exceedingly obscure, but Ilya Ilyich was able to gather from them that the governor had thoroughly made up his mind that there were political manifestos, and that Shpigulin's factory hands were being incited to a socialist rising, and that he was so persuaded of it that he would perhaps have regretted it if the story had turned out to be nonsense. He wants to get distinction in Petersburg, our wily Ilya Ilyich thought to himself as he left von Lemka. Well, that just suits me. But I am convinced that poor Andrei Antonovich would not have desired a rebellion even for the sake of distinguishing himself. He was a most conscientious official, who had lived in a state of innocence up to the time of his marriage. And was it his fault that, instead of an innocent allowance of wood from the government and an equally innocent Minchin, a princess of 40 summers had raised him to her level? I know almost for certain that the unmistakable symptoms of the mental condition which brought poor Andrei Antonovich to a well-known establishment in Switzerland, where, I am told, he is now regaining his energies, were first apparent on that fatal morning. But once we admit that unmistakable signs of something were visible that morning, it may well be allowed that similar symptoms may have been evident the day before, though not so clearly. I happen to know from the most private sources, well, you may assume that Yulia Mihailovna later on, not in triumph but almost in remorse, for a woman is incapable of complete remorse, revealed part of it to me herself, that Andrei Antonovich had gone into his wife's room in the middle of the previous night, past 2 o'clock in the morning, had waked her up, and had insisted on her listening to his ultimatum. He demanded it so insistently that she was obliged to get up from her bed in indignation and curl papers, and, sitting down on a couch, she had to listen, though with sarcastic disdain. Only then she grasped for the first time how far gone her Andrei Antonovich was, and was secretly horrified. She ought to have thought what she was about and have been softened, but she concealed her horror and was more obstinate than ever. Like every wife she had her own method of treating Andrei Antonovich, which she had tried more than once already and with it driven him to frenzy. Yulia Mihailovna's method was that of contemptuous silence, for 1 hour, 2, a whole day and almost for 3 days and nights silence whatever happened, whatever he said, whatever he did, even if he had clambered up to throw himself out of a 3-story window, a method unendurable for a sensitive man. Whether Yulia Mihailovna meant to punish her husband for his blunders of the last few days and the jealous envy he, as the chief authority in the town, felt for her administrative abilities, whether she was indignant at his criticism of her behavior with the young people and local society generally, and lack of comprehension of her subtle and far-sighted political aims, or was angry with his stupid and senseless jealousy of Fyodor Stepanovich, however that may have been, she made up her mind not to be softened even now, in spite of its being 3 o'clock at night, and though Andrei Antonovich was in a state of emotion such as she had never seen him in before. Pacing up and down in all directions over the rugs of her boudoir, beside himself, he poured out everything, quite disconnectedly, it's true, but everything that had been rankling in his heart, for it was outrageous. He began by saying that he was a laughingstock to everyone and was being led by the nose. "Curse the expression," he squealed, at once catching her smile, "let it stand, it's true." "No, madam, the time has come, let me tell you it's not a time for laughter in feminine arts now. We are not in the boudoir of a mincing lady, but like two abstract creatures in a balloon who have met to speak the truth." He was no doubt confused and could not find the right words for his ideas, however just they were. "It is you, madam, you who have destroyed my happy past. I took up this post simply for your sake, for the sake of your ambition." You smile sarcastically? Don't triumph, don't be in a hurry. "Let me tell you, madam, let me tell you that I should have been equal to this position, and not only this position but a dozen positions like it, for I have abilities, but with you, madam, with you, it's impossible, for with you here I have no abilities. There cannot be two centers, and you have created two, one of mine and one in your boudoir, two centers of power, madam, but I won't allow it, I won't allow it. In the service, as in marriage, there must be one center, two are impossible. How have you repaid me?" he went on. "Our marriage has been nothing but your proving to me all the time, every hour, that I am a non-entity, a fool, and even a rascal, and I have been all the time, every hour, forced in a degrading way to prove to you that I am not a non-entity, not a fool at all, and that I impress everyone with my honorable character. Isn't that degrading for both sides?" At this point he began rapidly stamping with both feet on the carpet, so that Yulia Mihailovna was obliged to get up with stern dignity. He subsided quickly, but passed to being pathetic and began sobbing, yes, sobbing, beating himself on the breast almost for 5 minutes, getting more and more frantic at Yulia Mihailovna's profound silence. At last he made a fatal blunder, and let slip that he was jealous of Fyodor Stepanovich. Realizing that he had made an utter fool of himself, he became savagely furious, and shouted that he would not allow them to deny God and that he would send her salon of irresponsible infidels packing, that the governor of a province was bound to believe in God and so his wife was too, that he wouldn't put up with these young men, that you, madam, for the sake of your own dignity, ought to have thought of your husband and to have stood up for his intelligence even if he were a man of poor abilities, and I'm by no means a man of poor abilities, and yet it's your doing that everyone here despises me, it was you put them all up to it. He shouted that he would annihilate the woman question, that he would eradicate every trace of it, that tomorrow he would forbid and break up their silly fate for the benefit of the governesses, damn them, that the first governess he came across tomorrow morning he would drive out of the province with a Cossack. "I'll make a point of it," he shrieked. "Do you know," he screamed, "do you know that your rascals are inciting men at the factory, and that I know it? Let me tell you, I know the names of 4 of these rascals and that I am going out of my mind, hopelessly, hopelessly." But at this point Yulia Mihailovna suddenly broke her silence and sternly announced that she had long been aware of these criminal designs, and that it was all foolishness, and that he had taken it too seriously, and that as for these mischievous fellows, she knew not only those 4 but all of them, it was a lie, but that she had not the faintest intention of going out of her mind on account of it, but, on the contrary, had all the more confidence in her intelligence and hoped to bring it all to a harmonious conclusion, to encourage the young people, to bring them to reason, to show them suddenly and unexpectedly that their designs were known, and then to point out to them new aims for rational and more noble activity. Oh, how can I describe the effect of this on Andrei Antonovich? Hearing that Fyodor Stepanovich had duped him again and had made a fool of him so coarsely, that he had told her much more than he had told him, and sooner than him, and that perhaps Fyodor Stepanovich was the chief instigator of all these criminal designs, he flew into a frenzy. "Senseless but malignant woman," he cried, snapping his bonds at one blow, "let me tell you, I shall arrest your worthless lover at once, I shall put him in fetters and send him to the fortress, or I shall jump out of a window before your eyes this minute." Yulia Mihailovna, turning green with anger, greeted this tirade at once with a burst of prolonged, ringing laughter, going off into peals such as one hears at the French theatre when a Parisian actress, imported for a fee of 100,000 to play a coquette, laughs in her husband's face for daring to be jealous of her. Von Lemke rushed to the window, but suddenly stopped as though rooted to the spot, folded his arms across his chest, and, white as a corpse, looked with a sinister gaze at the laughing lady. "Do you know, Yulia, do you know," he said in a gasping and suppliant voice, "do you know that even I can do something?" But at the renewed and even louder laughter that followed his last words he clenched his teeth, groaned, and suddenly rushed, not towards the window, but at his spouse, with his fist raised. He did not bring it down, no, I repeat again and again, no, but it was the last straw. He ran to his own room, not knowing what he was doing, flung himself, dressed as he was, face downwards on his bed, wrapped himself convulsively, head and all, in the sheet, and lay so for 2 hours, incapable of sleep, incapable of thought, with a load on his heart and blank, immovable despair in his soul. Now and then he shivered all over with an agonizing, feverish tremor. Disconnected and irrelevant things kept coming into his mind. At one minute he thought of the old clock which used to hang on his wall 15 years ago in Petersburg and had lost the minute hand, at another of the cheerful clerk, Milbois, and how they had once caught a sparrow together in Alexandrovsky Park and had laughed so that they could be heard all over the park, remembering that one of them was already a college assessor. I imagine that about 7 in the morning he must have fallen asleep without being aware of it himself, and must have slept with enjoyment, with agreeable dreams. Waking about 10 o'clock, he jumped wildly out of bed, remembered everything at once, and slapped himself on the head. He refused his breakfast, and would see neither Blum nor the chief of the police nor the clerk who came to remind him that he was expected to preside over a meeting that morning. He would listen to nothing, and did not want to understand. He ran like one possessed to Yulia Mihailovna's part of the house. There's Sofia Antropovna, an old lady of good family who had lived for years with Yulia Mihailovna, explained to him that his wife had set off at 10 o'clock that morning with a large company in 3 carriages to Varvara Petrovna Stavrogin's, to Skvoroshniki, to look over the place with a view to the second fete which was planned for a fortnight later, and that the visit today had been arranged with Varvara Petrovna 3 days before. Overwhelmed with this news, Andrei Antonovich returned to his study and impulsively ordered the horses. He could hardly wait for them to be got ready. His soul was hungering for Yulia Mihailovna, to look at her, to be near her for 5 minutes. Perhaps she would glance at him, notice him, would smile as before, forgive him. Oh! Aren't the horses ready? Mechanically he opened a thick book lying on the table. He sometimes used to try his fortune in this way with a book, opening it at random and reading the 3 lines at the top of the right-hand page. What turned up was, Tout est pour le mieux dans le meilleur de mondes possibles. Voltaire, Candide. He uttered an ejaculation of contempt and ran to get into the carriage. Skvoroshniki. The coachman said afterwards that his master urged him on all the way, but as soon as they were getting near the mansion he suddenly told him to turn and drive back to the town, bidding him, "Drive fast, please drive fast." Before they reached the town wall, master told me to stop again, got out of the carriage, and went across the road into the field. I thought he felt ill, but he stopped and began looking at the flowers, and so he stood for a time. It was strange, really, I began to feel quite uneasy. This was the coachman's testimony. I remember the weather that morning. It was a cold, clear, but windy September day. Before Andrei Antonovich stretched a forbidding landscape of bare fields from which the crop had long been harvested. There were a few dying yellow flowers, pitiful relics blown about by the howling wind. Did he want to compare himself and his fate with those wretched flowers battered by the autumn and the frost? I don't think so. In fact, I feel sure it was not so, and that he realized nothing about the flowers in spite of the evidence of the coachman and of the police superintendent, who drove up at that moment and asserted afterwards that he found the governor with a bunch of yellow flowers in his hand. This police superintendent, Flybusterov by name, was an ardent champion of authority who had only recently come to our town but had already distinguished himself and become famous by his inordinate zeal, by a certain vehemence in the execution of his duties, and his inveterate inebriety. Jumping out of the carriage, and not the least disconcerted at the sight of what the governor was doing, he blurted out all in one breath, with a frantic expression, yet with an air of conviction, that there's an upset in the town. Eh? What? Said Andrei Antonovitch, turning to him with a stern face, but without a trace of surprise or any recollection of his carriage and his coachman, as though he had been in his own study. Police Superintendent Flybusterov, Your Excellency. There's a riot in the town. Filibusters? Andrei Antonovitch said thoughtfully. Just so, Your Excellency. The Spigulin men are making a riot. The Spigulin men. The name Spigulin seemed to remind him of something. He started and put his finger to his forehead. The Spigulin men. In silence, and still plunged in thought, he walked without haste to the carriage, took his seat, and told the coachman to drive to the town. The police superintendent followed in the droshky. I imagine that he had vague impressions of many interesting things of all sorts on the way, but I doubt whether he had any definite idea or any settled intention as he drove into the open space in front of his house. But no sooner did he see the resolute and orderly ranks of the rioters, the cordon of police, the helpless, and perhaps purposely helpless, chief of police, and the general expectation of which he was the object, then all the blood rushed to his heart. With a pale face he stepped out of his carriage. Caps off, he said breathlessly and hardly audibly. On your knees, he squealed, to the surprise of everyone, to his own surprise too, and perhaps the very unexpectedness of the position was the explanation of what followed. Can a sledge on a switchback at Carnival stop short as it flies down the hill? What made it worse, Andrei Antonovitch had been all his life serene in character, and never shouted or stamped at anyone, and such people are always the most dangerous if it once happens that something sets their sledge sliding downhill. Everything was whirling before his eyes. Filibusters, he yelled still more shrilly and absurdly, and his voice broke. He stood, not knowing what he was going to do, but knowing and feeling in his whole being that he certainly would do something directly. Lord, was heard from the crowd. A lad began crossing himself. 3 or 4 men actually did try to kneel down, but the whole mass moved 3 steps forward, and suddenly all began talking at once. Your Excellency, we were hired for a term, the manager, you mustn't say, and so on and so on. It was impossible to distinguish anything. Alas! Andrei Antonovitch could distinguish nothing. The flowers were still in his hands. The riot was as real to him as the prison carts were to Stepan Trofimovitch. And flitting to and fro in the crowd of rioters who gazed open-eyed at him, he seemed to see Fyodor Stepanovitch, who had egged them on, Fyodor Stepanovitch, whom he hated and whose image had never left him since yesterday. Rods, he cried even more unexpectedly. A dead silence followed. From the facts I have learnt and those I have conjectured, this must have been what happened at the beginning, but I have no such exact information for what followed, nor can I conjecture it so easily. There are some facts, however. In the first place, rods were brought on the scene with strange rapidity. They had evidently been got ready beforehand in expectation by the intelligent chief of the police. Not more than 2, or at most 3, were actually flogged, however. That fact I wish to lay stress on. It's an absolute fabrication to say that the whole crowd of rioters, or at least half of them, were punished. It is a nonsensical story, too, that a poor but respectable lady was caught as she passed by and promptly thrashed, yet I read myself an account of this incident afterwards among the provincial items of a Petersburg newspaper. Many people in the town talked of an old woman called Avdosya Petrovna Terapygin who lived in the almshouse by the cemetery. She was said, on her way home from visiting a friend, to have forced her way into the crowd of spectators through natural curiosity. Seeing what was going on, she cried out, "What a shame," and spat on the ground. For this it was said she had been seized and flogged too. This story not only appeared in print, but in our excitement we positively got up a subscription for her benefit. I subscribed 20 kopecks myself. And would you believe it? It appears now that there was no old woman called Terapygian living in the almshouse at all. I went to inquire at the almshouse by the cemetery myself. They had never heard of anyone called Terapygian there, and, what's more, they were quite offended when I told them the story that was going round. I mentioned this fabulous Avdotia Petrovna because what happened to her, if she really had existed, very nearly happened to Stepan Trofimovich. Possibly, indeed, his adventure may have been at the bottom of the ridiculous tale about the old woman, that is, as the gossip went on growing he was transformed into this old dame. What I find most difficult to understand is how he came to slip away from me as soon as he got into the square. As I had a misgiving of something very unpleasant, I wanted to take him round the square straight to the entrance to the governor's, but my own curiosity was roused, and I stopped only for 1 minute to question the first person I came across, and suddenly I looked round and found Stepan Trofimovich no longer at my side. Instinctively I darted off to look for him in the most dangerous place. Something made me feel that his sledge, too, was flying downhill. And I did, as a fact, find him in the very center of things. I remember I seized him by the arm, but he looked quietly and proudly at me with an air of immense authority. "Cher," he pronounced in a voice which quivered on a breaking note, "if they are dealing with people so unceremoniously before us, in an open square, what is to be expected from that man, for instance, if he happens to act on his own authority?" And shaking with indignation and with an intense desire to defy them, he pointed a menacing, accusing finger at Flybusterov, who was gazing at us open-eyed 2 paces away. "That man," cried the latter, blind with rage. "What man? And who are you?" He stepped up to him, clenching his fist. "Who are you?" he roared ferociously, hysterically, and desperately. I must mention that he knew Stepan Trofimovich perfectly well by sight. Another moment and he would have certainly seized him by the collar, but luckily, hearing him shout, Lemka turned his head. He gazed intensely but with perplexity at Stepan Trofimovich, seeming to consider something, and suddenly he shook his hand impatiently. Flybusterov was checked. I drew Stepan Trofimovich out of the crowd, though perhaps he may have wished to retreat himself. "Home, home," I insisted. It was certainly thanks to Lemka that we were not beaten. "Go, my friend, I am to blame for exposing you to this. You have a future and a career of a sort before you, while I Mona est sani." He resolutely mounted the governor's steps. The hall porter knew me. I said that we both wanted to see Yulia Mihailovna. We sat down in the waiting room and waited. I was unwilling to leave my friend, but I thought it unnecessary to say anything more to him. He had the air of a man who had consecrated himself to certain death for the sake of his country. We sat down, not side by side, but in different corners, I nearer to the entrance, he at some distance facing me, with his head bent in thought, leaning lightly on his stick. He held his wide-brimmed hat in his left hand. We sat like that for 10 minutes. 2. Lemka suddenly came in with rapid steps, accompanied by the chief of police, looked absent-mindedly at us and, taking no notice of us, was about to pass into his study on the right, but Stepan Trofimovich stood before him blocking his way. The tall figure of Stepan Trofimovich, so unlike other people, made an impression. Lemka stopped. "Who is this?" he muttered, puzzled, as if he were questioning the chief of police, though he did not turn his head towards him, and was all the time gazing at Stepan Trofimovich. "Retired college assessor, Stepan Trofimovich Verhovensky, Your Excellency," answered Stepan Trofimovich, bowing majestically. His Excellency went on staring at him with a very blank expression, however. "What is it?" And with the curtness of a great official he turned his ear to Stepan Trofimovich with disdainful impatience, taking him for an ordinary person with a written petition of some sort. "I was visited and my house was searched today by an official acting in Your Excellency's name, therefore I am desirous." "Name? Name?" Lemka asked impatiently, seeming suddenly to have an inkling of something. Stepan Trofimovich repeated his name still more majestically. It's that hotbed. You have shown yourself, sir, in such a light. Are you a professor? A professor? I once had the honor of giving some lectures to the young men of the X-University. The young men. Lemke seemed to start, though I am ready to bet that he grasped very little of what was going on, or even, perhaps, did not know with whom he was talking. That, sir, I won't allow, he cried, suddenly getting terribly angry. I won't allow young men. It's all these manifestos? It's an assault on society, sir, a piratical attack, filibustering. What is your request? On the contrary, your wife requested me to read something tomorrow at her fete. I've not come to make a request but to ask for my rights. At the fete? There'll be no fete. I won't allow your fete. A lecture? A lecture, he screamed furiously. I should be very glad if you would speak to me rather more politely, Your Excellency, without stamping or shouting at me as though I were a boy. Perhaps you understand whom you are speaking to, said Lemke, turning crimson. Perfectly, Your Excellency. I am protecting society while you are destroying it. You? I remember about you, though, you used to be a tutor in the house of Madame Stavrogin? Yes, I was in the position of tutor in the house of Madame Stavrogin. And have been for 20 years the hotbed of all that has now accumulated, all the fruits. I believe I saw you just now in the square. You'd better look out, sir, you'd better look out, your way of thinking is well known. You may be sure that I keep my eye on you. I cannot allow your lectures, sir, I cannot. Don't come with such requests to me. He would have passed on again. I repeat that Your Excellency is mistaken. It was your wife who asked me to give, not a lecture, but a literary reading at the fete tomorrow. But I decline to do so in any case now. I humbly request that you will explain to me if possible how, why, and for what reason I was subjected to an official search today. Some of my books and papers, private letters to me, were taken from me and wheeled through the town in a barrow. Who searched you? Said Lemke, starting and returning to full consciousness of the position. He suddenly flushed all over. He turned quickly to the chief of police. At that moment the long, stooping, and awkward figure of Blum appeared in the doorway. Why, this official here, said Stepan Trofimovich, indicating him. Blum came forward with a face that admitted his responsibility but showed no contrition. Vous en faites que de bêtises, Lemke threw at him in a tone of vexation and anger, and suddenly he was transformed and completely himself again. Excuse me, he muttered, utterly disconcerted and turning absolutely crimson, all this was probably a mere blunder, a misunderstanding, nothing but a misunderstanding. Your Excellency, observed Stepan Trofimovich, once when I was young I saw a characteristic incident. In the corridor of a theater a man ran up to another and gave him a sounding smack in the face before the whole public. Perceiving at once that his victim was not the person whom he had intended to chastise but someone quite different who only slightly resembled him, he pronounced angrily, with the haste of one whose moments are precious as Your Excellency did just now, I've made a mistake, excuse me, it was a misunderstanding, nothing but a misunderstanding. And when the offended man remained resentful and cried out, he observed to him, with extreme annoyance, why, I tell you it was a misunderstanding. What are you crying out about? That's very amusing, of course, Lemke gave a wry smile, but can't you see how unhappy I am myself? He almost screamed, and seemed about to hide his face in his hands. This unexpected and piteous exclamation, almost a sob, was almost more than one could bear. It was probably the first moment since the previous day that he had full, vivid consciousness of all that had happened, and it was followed by complete, humiliating despair that could not be disguised. Who knows, in another minute he might have sobbed aloud. For the first moment Stepan Trofimovich looked wildly at him, then he suddenly bowed his head and in a voice pregnant with feeling pronounced, "Your Excellency, don't trouble yourself with my petulant complaint, and only give orders for my books and letters to be restored to me." He was interrupted. At that very instant Yulia Mihailovna returned and entered noisily with all the party which had accompanied her. But at this point I should like to tell my story in as much detail as possible. 3. In the first place, the whole company who had filled 3 carriages crowded into the waiting room. There was a special entrance to Yulia Mihailovna's apartments on the left as one entered the house, but on this occasion they all went through the waiting room, and I imagine just because Stepan Trofimovich was there, and because all that had happened to him as well as the Shpigulin affair had reached Yulia Mihailovna's ears as she drove into the town. Lyamshin, who for some misdemeanor had not been invited to join the party and so knew all that had been happening in the town before anyone else, brought her the news. With spiteful glee he hired a wretched Cossack nag and hastened on the way to Skvoreshniki to meet the returning cavalcade with the diverting intelligence. I fancy that, in spite of her lofty determination, Yulia Mihailovna was a little disconcerted on hearing such surprising news, but probably only for an instant. The political aspect of the affair, for instance, could not cause her uneasiness. Fyodor Stepanovich had impressed upon her 3 or 4 times that the Shpigulin ruffians ought to be flogged, and Fyodor Stepanovich certainly had for some time past been a great authority in her eyes. But, anyway, I shall make him pay for it, she doubtless reflected, the he, of course, referring to her spouse. I must observe in passing that on this occasion, as though purposely, Fyodor Stepanovich had taken no part in the expedition, and no one had seen him all day. I must mention too, by the way, that Varvara Petrovna had come back to the town with her guests, in the same carriage with Yulia Mihailovna, in order to be present at the last meeting of the committee which was arranging the fete for the next day. She too must have been interested, and perhaps even agitated, by the news about Stepan Trofimovich communicated by Lyamshin. The hour of reckoning for Andrei Antonovich followed at once. Alas! He felt that from the first glance at his admirable wife. With an open air and an enchanting smile she went quickly up to Stepan Trofimovich, held out her exquisitely gloved hand, and greeted him with a perfect shower of flattering phrases, as though the only thing she cared about that morning was to make haste to be charming to Stepan Trofimovich because at last she saw him in her house. There was not one hint of the search that morning, it was as though she knew nothing of it. There was not one word to her husband, not one glance in his direction, as though he had not been in the room. What's more, she promptly confiscated Stepan Trofimovich and carried him off to the drawing room as though he had had no interview with Lemka, or as though it was not worth prolonging if he had. I repeat again, I think that in this, Yulia Mihailovna, in spite of her aristocratic tone, made another great mistake. And Karmazinov particularly did much to aggravate this. He had taken part in the expedition at Yulia Mihailovna's special request, and in that way had, incidentally, paid his visit to Varvara Petrovna, and she was so poor-spirited as to be perfectly delighted at it. On seeing Stepan Trofimovich, he called out from the doorway, he came in behind the rest, and pressed forward to embrace him, even interrupting Yulia Mihailovna. What years, what ages! At last, excellent Ami. He made as though to kiss him, offering his cheek, of course, and Stepan Trofimovich was so fluttered that he could not avoid saluting it. Cher, he said to me that evening, recalling all the events of that day, I wondered at that moment which of us was the most contemptible, he, embracing me only to humiliate me, or I, despising him and his face and kissing it on the spot, though I might have turned away. Phoo! Come, tell me about yourself, tell me everything, Karmazinov drawled and lisped, as though it were possible for him on the spur of the moment to give an account of 25 years of his life. But this foolish trifling was the height of chic. Remember that the last time we met was at the Granovsky dinner in Moscow, and that 24 years have passed since then. Stepan Trofimovich began very reasonably, and consequently not at all in the same chic style. "Ce cher homme," Karmazinov interrupted with shrill familiarity, squeezing his shoulder with exaggerated friendliness. "Make haste and take us to your room, Yulia Mihailovna, there he'll sit down and tell us everything." "And yet I was never at all intimate with that peevish old woman," Stepan Trofimovich went on complaining to me that same evening, shaking with anger. "We were almost boys, and I'd begun to detest him even then, just as he had me, of course." Yulia Mihailovna's drawing room filled up quickly. Varvara Petrovna was particularly excited, though she tried to appear indifferent, but I caught her once or twice glancing with hatred at Karmazinov and with wrath at Stepan Trofimovich, the wrath of anticipation, the wrath of jealousy and love. If Stepan Trofimovich had blundered this time and had let Karmazinov make him look small before everyone, I believe she would have leapt up and beaten him. I have forgotten to say that Liza too was there, and I had never seen her more radiant, carelessly light-hearted, and happy. Mavriky Nikolaevich was there too, of course. In the crowd of young ladies and rather vulgar young men who made up Yulia Mihailovna's usual retinue, and among whom this vulgarity was taken for sprightliness, and cheap cynicism for wit, I noticed 2 or 3 new faces: a very obsequious Pole who was on a visit in the town, a German doctor, a sturdy old fellow who kept loudly laughing with great zest at his own wit, and lastly, a very young princeling from Petersburg, like an automaton figure, with the deportment of a state dignitary and a fearfully high collar. But it was evident that Yulia Mihailovna had a very high opinion of this visitor, and was even a little anxious of the impression her salon was making on him. "Cher M. Karmazinov," said Stepan Trofimovich, sitting in a picturesque pose on the sofa and suddenly beginning to lisp as daintily as Karmazinov himself, "Cher M. Karmazinov, the life of a man of our time and of certain convictions, even after an interval of 25 years, is bound to seem monotonous." The German went off into a loud abrupt guffaw like an A, evidently imagining that Stepan Trofimovich had said something exceedingly funny. The latter gazed at him with studied amazement but produced no effect on him whatever. The prince, too, looked at the German, turning head, collar and all, towards him and putting up his pince-nez, though without the slightest curiosity. "Is bound to seem monotonous," Stepan Trofimovich intentionally repeated, drawling each word as deliberately and nonchalantly as possible. "And so my life has been throughout this quarter of a century, et comme on trouve partout plus de moins que de raison, and as I am entirely of this opinion, it has come to pass that throughout this quarter of a century I—" "C'est charmant, les moines," whispered Yulia Mihailovna, turning to Varvara Petrovna, who was sitting beside her. Varvara Petrovna responded with a look of pride. But Karmazinov could not stomach the success of the French phrase, and quickly and shrilly interrupted Stepan Trofimovich. "As for me, I am quite at rest on that score, and for the past 7 years I've been settled at Karlsruhe. And last year, when it was proposed by the town council to lay down a new water pipe, I felt in my heart that this question of water pipes in Karlsruhe was dearer and closer to my heart than all the questions of my precious fatherland, in this period of so-called reform. I can't help sympathizing, though it goes against the grain," sighed Stepan Trofimovich, bowing his head significantly. Yulia Mihailovna was triumphant. The conversation was becoming profound and taking a political turn. "A drain pipe?" the doctor inquired in a loud voice. "A water pipe, doctor, a water pipe," and I positively assisted them in drawing up the plan. The doctor went off into a deafening guffaw. Many people followed his example, laughing in the face of the doctor, who remained unconscious of it and was highly delighted that everyone was laughing. "You must allow me to differ from you, Karmazinov," Yulia Mihailovna hastened to interpose. "Karlsruhe is all very well, but you are fond of mystifying people, and this time we don't believe you. What Russian writer has presented so many modern types, has brought forward so many contemporary problems, has put his finger on the most vital modern points which make up the type of the modern man of action? You, only you, and no one else. It's no use your assuring us of your coldness towards your own country and your ardent interest in the water pipes of Karlsruhe. Ha ha. Yes, no doubt, lisped Karmazinov. I have portrayed in the character of Prigozhiev all the failings of the Slavophiles and in the character of Nikodimov all the failings of the Westerners. I say, hardly all. Lyamshin whispered slyly. But I do this, by the way, simply to while away the tedious hours and to satisfy the persistent demands of my fellow countrymen. You are probably aware, Stepan Trofimovich, Yulia Mihailovna went on enthusiastically, that tomorrow we shall have the delight of hearing the charming lines, one of the last of Semyon Yakovlevich's exquisite literary inspirations. It's called Merci. He announces in this piece that he will write no more, that nothing in the world will induce him to, if angels from heaven or, what's more, all the best society were to implore him to change his mind. In fact, he is laying down the pen for good, and this graceful merci is addressed to the public in grateful acknowledgement of the constant enthusiasm with which it has for so many years greeted his unswerving loyalty to true Russian thought. Yulia Mihailovna was at the acme of bliss. Yes, I shall make my farewell, I shall say my merci and depart, and there, in Karlsruhe, I shall close my eyes. Karmazinov was gradually becoming maudlin. Like many of our great writers, and there are numbers of them amongst us, he could not resist praise, and began to be limp at once, in spite of his penetrating wit. But I consider this as pardonable. They say that one of our Shakespeares positively blurted out in private conversation that we great men can't do otherwise, and so on, and, what's more, was unaware of it. There in Karlsruhe I shall close my eyes. When we have done our duty, all that's left for us great men is to make haste to close our eyes without seeking a reward. I shall do so too. Give me the address and I shall come to Karlsruhe to visit your tomb, said the German, laughing immoderately. They send corpses by rail nowadays, one of the less important young men said unexpectedly. Lyamshin positively shrieked with delight. Yulia Mihailovna frowned. Nikolai Stavrogin walked in. Why, I was told that you were locked up, he said aloud, addressing Stepan Trofimovich before everyone else. No, it was a case of unlocking, jested Stepan Trofimovich. But I hope that what's happened will have no influence on what I asked you to do, Yulia Mihailovna put in again. I trust that you will not let this unfortunate annoyance, of which I had no idea, lead you to disappoint our eager expectations and deprive us of the enjoyment of hearing your reading at our literary matinee. I don't know, now. Really, I am so unlucky, Varvara Petrovna, and only fancy, just when I was so longing to make the personal acquaintance of one of the most remarkable and independent intellects of Russia, and here Stepan Trofimovich suddenly talks of deserting us. Your compliment is uttered so audibly that I ought to pretend not to hear it, Stepan Trofimovich said neatly, but I cannot believe that my insignificant presence is so indispensable at your fate tomorrow. However, Why, you'll spoil him, cried Fyodor Stepanovich, bursting into the room. I've only just got him in hand, and in one morning he has been searched, arrested, taken by the collar by a policeman, and here ladies are cooing to him in the governor's drawing-room. Every bone in his body is aching with rapture, in his wildest dreams he had never hoped for such good fortune. Now he'll begin informing against the socialists after this. Impossible, Fyodor Stepanovich. Socialism is too grand an idea to be unrecognized by Stepan Trofimovich. Yulia Mihailovna took up the gauntlet with energy. It's a great idea, but its exponents are not always great men, et Brysonslaw, mon cher, Stepan Trofimovich ended, addressing his son and rising gracefully from his seat. But at this point an utterly unexpected circumstance occurred. Von Lemke had been in the room for some time but seemed unnoticed by anyone, though everyone had seen him come in. In accordance with her former plan, Yulia Mihailovna went on ignoring him. He took up his position near the door and with a stern face listened gloomily to the conversation. Hearing an allusion to the events of the morning, he began fidgeting uneasily, stared at the prince, obviously struck by his stiffly starched, prominent collar. Then suddenly he seemed to start on hearing the voice of Pyotr Stepanovich and seeing him burst in, and no sooner had Stepan Trofimovich uttered his phrase about socialists than Lemke went up to him, pushing against Lyamshin, who at once skipped out of the way with an affected gesture of surprise, rubbing his shoulder and pretending that he had been terribly bruised. "Enough," said von Lemke to Stepan Trofimovich, vigorously gripping the hand of the dismayed gentleman and squeezing it with all his might in both of his. "Enough! The filibusters of our day are unmasked. Not another word. Measures have been taken." He spoke loudly enough to be heard by all the room, and concluded with energy. The impression he produced was poignant. Everybody felt that something was wrong. I saw Yulia Mihailovna turn pale. The effect was heightened by a trivial accident. After announcing that measures had been taken, Lemke turned sharply and walked quickly towards the door, but he had hardly taken 2 steps when he stumbled over a rug, swerved forward, and almost fell. For a moment he stood still, looked at the rug at which he had stumbled, and, uttering a loud "Change it," went out of the room. Yulia Mihailovna ran after him. Her exit was followed by an uproar, in which it was difficult to distinguish anything. Some said he was deranged, others that he was liable to attacks, others put their fingers to their forehead. Lyamshin, in the corner, put his 2 fingers above his forehead. People hinted at some domestic difficulties in a whisper, of course. No one took up his hat, all were waiting. I don't know what Yulia Mihailovna managed to do, but 5 minutes later she came back, doing her utmost to appear composed. She replied evasively that Andrei Antonovich was rather excited, but that it meant nothing, that he had been like that from a child, that she knew much better, and that the fete next day would certainly cheer him up. Then followed a few flattering words to Stepan Trofimovich simply from civility, and a loud invitation to the members of the committee to open the meeting now, at once. Only then, all who were not members of the committee prepared to go home, but the painful incidents of this fatal day were not yet over. I noticed at the moment when Nikolai Stavrogin came in that Liza looked quickly and intently at him and was for a long time unable to take her eyes off him, so much so that at last it attracted attention. I saw Mavriky Nikolaevich bend over her from behind. He seemed to mean to whisper something to her, but evidently changed his intention and drew himself up quickly, looking round at everyone with a guilty air. Nikolai Syabolodovich too excited curiosity. His face was paler than usual and there was a strangely absent-minded look in his eyes. After flinging his question at Stepan Trofimovich he seemed to forget about him altogether, and I really believe he even forgot to speak to his hostess. He did not once look at Liza, not because he did not want to, but I am certain because he did not notice her either. And suddenly, after the brief silence that followed Yulia Mihailovna's invitation to open the meeting without loss of time, Liza's musical voice, intentionally loud, was heard. She called to Stavrogin. "Nikolai Syabolodovich, a captain who calls himself a relation of yours, the brother of your wife, and whose name is Lebyadkin, keeps writing impertinent letters to me, complaining of you and offering to tell me some secrets about you. If he really is a connection of yours, please tell him not to annoy me, and save me from this unpleasantness." There was a note of desperate challenge in these words, everyone realized it. The accusation was unmistakable, though perhaps it was a surprise to herself. She was like a man who shuts his eyes and throws himself from the roof. But Nikolai Stavrogin's answer was even more astounding. To begin with, it was strange that he was not in the least surprised and listened to Liza with unruffled attention. There was no trace of either confusion or anger in his face. Simply, firmly, even with an air of perfect readiness, he answered the fatal question. Yes, I have the misfortune to be connected with that man. I have been the husband of his sister for nearly 5 years. You may be sure I will give him your message as soon as possible, and I'll answer for it that he shan't annoy you again. I shall never forget the horror that was reflected on the face of Varvara Petrovna. With a distracted air she got up from her seat, lifting up her right hand as though to ward off a blow. Nikolai Vsyevolodovitch looked at her, looked at Liza, at the spectators, and suddenly smiled with infinite disdain. He walked deliberately out of the room. Everyone saw how Liza leapt up from the sofa as soon as he turned to go and unmistakably made a movement to run after him. But she controlled herself and did not run after him. She went quietly out of the room without saying a word or even looking at anyone, accompanied, of course, by Mavriky Nikolaevich, who rushed after her. The uproar and the gossip that night in the town I will not attempt to describe. Varvara Petrovna shut herself up in her town house and Nikolai Vsyevolodovitch, it was said, went straight to Skvoreshniki without seeing his mother. Stepan Trofimovitch sent me that evening to set Cher Amy to implore her to allow him to come to her, but she would not see me. He was terribly overwhelmed, he shed tears. Such a marriage! Such a marriage! Such an awful thing in the family, he kept repeating. He remembered Karmazinov, however, and abused him terribly. He set to work vigorously to prepare for the reading too and the artistic temperament, rehearsed before the looking-glass and went over all the jokes and witticisms uttered in the course of his life which he had written down in a separate notebook, to insert into his reading next day. "My dear, I do this for the sake of a great idea," he said to me, obviously justifying himself. "Cher Ami, I have been stationary for 25 years and suddenly I've begun to move whither, I know not, but I've begun to move.